Hey everyone, this is a piece from the Trotsky Reappraisal edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. It's titled On the Verge of the Break, Trotsky and the Comintern in 1928. And it starts with a footnote. And the footnote says, in the interest of the balance and overall length of the volume, Dr. Vatlin's introductory section has been summarized by Terry Brotherstone. So, On the Verge of the Break, Trotsky and the Comintern in 1928 by A. Vatlin. This essay concentrates on the events of a single year, but it was a year which saw a historic turn in the development of the left opposition in the international communist movement. Following the defeat of Trotsky and Trotsky's supporter in the struggle with the All-Union Communist Party, CPSU, the conflict was transferred to the arena of the Communist International, Comintern. Little has been written on this period due mainly to the tendency of historians to concentrate on the administrative measures by which the Stalinist majority routed the opposition. Yet what happened during this year is vital for an understanding of the future course of the opposition, which led eventually to the formation of the Fourth International. For Trotsky, the year 1928 in effect began in December 1927 at the 15th Congress of the Communist Party Soviet Union, which, having been expelled, Trotsky did not attend. Considerable time was given to Comintern representatives of the party, notably Clara Zetkin, to endorse vigorously the expulsion of the opposition. The oppositionists were accused of trying to forge links with co-thinkers in other parties. In contrast to their opponents, they put party unity first, and were determined to avoid providing the slightest justification for accusations that they were trying to form a second party. Although accused essentially of, quote, being in the service of world capital, end quote, they refused to make an appeal outside the party. They insisted that they would make no capitulation to, quote, bourgeois democracy, harking back rather to the discipline of Lenin's party when faced with hostile circumstances. Trotsky was exiled in Alma-Ata on the 17th of January 1928. At first, Trotsky saw this as a temporary banishment. Complaints at Trotsky's treatment from leaders of the Second International only fueled Stalinist accusations that the opposition was playing the game of the class enemy. The opposition was weakened in part because the opposition accepted the logic of this argument, if not the argument's applicability to itself. In a directive issued early in 1928, the opposition blamed the internal difficulties of the USSR on the, quote, insufficient activity of the European proletariat and the insufficient combativity of the European communist parties, end quote, but concluded that, quote, European social democracy, parenthesis, Menshevism, which gloatingly plays up all the information about the internal difficulties of the USSR, bears the main part of the responsibility for these difficulties, end quote. A piece published in Pravda, 15th of January 1928, bracket, The Challenge of the Left Opposition, 1928 to 1929. End footnote. The reality was that the, quote, Bolshevization of the European sections of the Comintern did not benefit Trotsky's supporters internationally, but led to their suffering the same fate as the Soviet oppositionists. The Comintern leadership, headed by Bukharin, feared that Trotsky's supporters might gain a basis abroad. Their weapon against this was the, quote, left turn, begun in autumn 1927, which identified the Social Democrats as the last barrier between the communists and the worker masses, and jettisoned the last traces of the, quote, united front policy pursued since the early 1920s. In appearance, this new line actually seemed to correspond to some of the formulations of the opposition. For example, in a letter to the 7th Plenum of the ECCI on the 14th of December 1926, where they said, quote, we consider the social democratic leaders to be the greatest enemies of the labor movement, end quote. The, quote, left turn, end quote, was not brought about by any major change in the world situation, in contrast to the turn to the, quote, popular front in the 1930s, but corresponded to the first signs of the grain procurement crisis of the winter of 1927 to 28, within the Soviet Union itself. Bukharin denied, as Bukharin had to, that the new policy had taken over the theoretical ground of the opposition, and it is not clear whether the similarities between the new policies and previous opposition statements were coincidences or deliberate copying. But what is clear is that relations between the Communist Party Soviet Union, the Cominterm, and the expelled oppositionists were redefined by the, quote, left turn. The definition of Trotskyism as a counter-revolutionary deviation now became policy rather than polemical rhetoric. Footnote: Dr. Vatlin's text takes over from here. Even before the opening of the ninth plenum of the ECCI, which had the task of consolidating the, quote, left term, a course towards sharpening the fight against the Trotskyists was proclaimed in the journal Kommunistische Internationale. The reasons given for this decision present extraordinary interest. Expecting, quote, an increased flow of social democratic workers to the Comintern, end quote, the leaders of the Comintern put forward a parallel with the revolutionary upsurge after the war, when such an onrush was checked by the, quote, centrists, who with their left-wing phrases restrained the masses from breaking with the Second International, end quote. In the new conditions, quote, the counter-revolutionary mission, now falls to the lot of the ultra-left and ultra-right oppositionists, who partially remain inside and are partially already thrown out of the Comintern, and whom the Trotskyists are now endeavoring to unite, end quote. The purpose of Bukharin's opening address to the ninth plenum of the ECCI on the 9th of February 1928 was to demonstrate the unity between Trotskyism and left-wing social democracy in the fight against the Comintern. Quote, from the standpoint of the problem of winning the masses, the Trotskyist opposition has to be seen not otherwise than as a barrier in the road to winning the masses for communism. In the German party, as in the parties of other countries, there was a debate about the role of the, quote, left social democratic leaders. In one of the resolutions of the Essen Congress, it was said that the leaders of the, quote, left wing of the Social Democrats must be seen as the main enemy, and that was absolutely correct, end quote. Bukharin. Later, Bukharin made the point that criticism of the USSR by left Social Democrats and Trotsky was more dangerous than such criticism coming from other quarters, because the worker masses listened to these people. In Bukharin's address in his debate at a distance with the already exiled Trotsky, considerable space was given to that question which was so much to the advantage of the victors, the question of the, quote, second party. The opposition had repeated, in the opposition's statement, issued on the eve of the plenum, the opposition's devotion to the dictatorship of the party, counterposing thereto, quote, thermidor, meaning a slide down into bourgeois democracy. At the same time, let us recall once more the, quote, amalgam. An endeavor to form a, quote, second party was attributed to the Stalinist party apparatus. This inconsistency in the opposition's platform did not escape Bukharin's attention. Quote, good, suppose we have two parties, but that presupposes the existence of a first party, and if we have a first and second party, then consequently we have two parties. But we have always maintained the view that, if two parties can exist here in the USSR, only one of them will rule while the other is in prison, end quote. Bukharin. It cannot be denied that Trotsky shared this view. Indeed, Trotsky had himself played an active part in the process which the court historians were later to call, quote, the establishment of the one-party system in our country, end quote. A simplified class approach had brought the Bolsheviks to the thesis, quote, one class, one party, end quote, which, however, left itself called into question, and which could not become a reality without the help of an apparatus of repression. Rejection of the democratic mechanism of political struggle brought the Trotskyists to agree even with Bukharin's thesis that, quote, in our country, Criticism such as the Trotskyist criticism leads inevitably to armed struggle for power, end quote. The opposition platform, quote, at a new stage, said practically the same thing, that a course towards a second party would lead the USSR to civil war. However, quote, the goal of the opposition is not a second party or civil war, but rectification of the line of the party and the state by the methods of deep-going reform, end quote. Metaphysically counterpoising party democracy and proletarian dictatorship and following the illusory choice, quote, party reform or second party, end quote, resulted both from the closed, elitist character of Trotsky's opposition and from the limited, inconsistent character of its program. Bukharin's calls for merciless struggle against Trotskyism in all the sections of the Comintern, Bukharin's declaration that without smashing Trotskyism, there could be, quote, no real struggle against social democracy, end quote, obviously exaggerated the danger. What danger threatened from a different, that danger threatened from a different quarter, and it was precisely Bukharin who, on the eve of his conflict with the Stalinist majority in the Central Committee, failed to draw with sufficient sobriety the lessons of the anti-Trotskyist campaign. The resolution of the 9th Plenum of the ECCI, which repeated the basic propositions of the 15th Congress resolution on the subject of the opposition, scarcely attracted as much attention among the exiled Trotskyists as the plenum's decisions on sharpening the fight against the Social Democrats, within the framework of the new, quote, class against class, end quote, tactic. The, quote, left turn by the Comintern, along with the repressive measures taken in the course of the grain procurement operation in the spring of 1928, evoked among the Trotskyists, as Trotsky's biographer Deutscher writes, feelings of literal exaltation. Indeed, despite the expulsion of the oppositionists, the party and Comintern seem to have taken their stand on the opposition's ideological theoretical platform. Trotsky drew a parallel between his supporters and the Paris Communards, whose defeat nevertheless saved France forever from the danger of a monarchist restoration. Contrary to the pressure by the, quote, rights on the Stalinist apparatus which Trotsky had prophesied, what actually happened was the opposite, if one takes into account the new disposition of forces. In his letter of the 9th of May to his supporters, Trotsky advocated critical support for the left course, even asserting that it, quote, facilitates the struggle for proletarian democracy, end quote. Trotsky, cited in the Deutscher's The Prophet Armed. It is interesting that, immediately after the 9th Plenum of the ECCI, the campaign against Trotskyism in the Comintern press died down. Contrary to what had been advocated in the plenum's resolution on the opposition, the emphasis on, quote, ideological exposure, end quote, was shifted to different targets, namely social democracy and the warmongers. All the less firm were the grounds for the oppositionists to yield to capitulationist moods. After the repentance of Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Pyatakov, followed a period which saw a certain consolidation of the opposition. Trotsky himself began active preparations for the 6th Congress of the Comintern, announced for the summer, and when Trotsky received a copy of the draft program, Trotsky at once set about making a critical analysis of this document. Footnote: even before the draft of a new program had appeared, he sought in a directive to the oppositionists to discredit it, quote, Bukharin's program is a bad program of a national section of the Comintern, but not the program of a world party, end quote. Remoteness from the day-to-day hurly-burly of political struggle unquestionably favored Trotsky as a theoretician. In his critique of the fundamental positions of the draft program of the Comintern, which Trotsky had sent to Moscow by June, and which was a solid work superior in every way to the draft itself, Trotsky summarized all his theoretical innovations and political arguments from the period of the United Opposition, concentrating his fire on the theory of, quote, socialism in one country. Trotsky could hardly have seriously supposed that his political opponents established in Moscow would allow this document to be discussed, or even that they would distribute it among the foreign delegates present at the Congress. The purpose of the critique of the draft program of the Comintern, of the critique of the fundamental positions of the draft program of the Comintern was different: to consolidate the forces of the opposition by creating a principled theoretical platform. Consequently, the overwhelming majority of the copies of the document were sent from Alma-Ata, not to Moscow, but to the place where Trotsky's supporters were exiled. Naturally, the draft program as a whole was rejected as the product of slipshod work, and because it had not been discussed in the Communist parties. Its compromising character, due to Bukharin's attempts to combine in one document a sober economic analysis of the situation in the world with the old ideological postulates about, quote, world revolutions, end quote, did not escape Trotsky's notice. For him, however, what was of predominant importance was the ideological element in the document, which helped him find arguments to sustain the charge of opportunism and, quote, national reformism against Stalin and Bukharin. This approach, though, prevented him from seeing the changes which had really taken place in the disposition of several political forces in Europe in the period of capitalist stabilization. Trotsky vows again and again his loyalty to a global, worldwide approach to the evolution of the epoch, to the evaluation of the epoch, and forgets the other side of the coin, the national upsurge of the European states after the World War, the absence of a dialectical understanding of the national and international endowed Trotsky's critique of the draft program with some strikingly apocalyptical features. It proclaimed that, quote, on August 4th, 1914, the death knell sounded for national programs for all time. The Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat can base itself only upon an international program corresponding to the character of the present epoch, the epoch of the highest development and collapse of capitalism, end quote. Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin. In conformity with his vision of the, quote, itinerary of the world revolution, end quote, set forth as early as 1925 in his book, Where is Britain Going?, Trotsky concentrates his attention on the Anglo-American antagonism, to which Trotsky is a class coloring. Quote, the resolution of the European chaos through the Soviet United States of Europe is one of the first tasks of the proletarian revolution. The latter will, most likely have to defend itself from the North American bourgeoisie, end quote. Let us give Trotsky his due for political perspicacity. Trotsky's forecast of, quote, the world hegemony of the USA, end quote, did become a reality, though only after the Second World War. Interesting also is Trotsky's specific vision, through, quote, revolutionary spectacles, end quote, of the inevitability of the process of European integration. In Trotsky's critique, Trotsky alleged that the Comintern had already abandoned the slogan of the, quote, United States of Europe in the mid-1920s, and Trotsky evidently linked that with the hated theory of socialism in one country. However, this was not true. In the draft program of the Comintern prepared by Bukharin in April 1928, the following thesis appeared, quote, the fragmentation of Europe, Europe's relative decline in comparison with mighty American imperialism, armed to the teeth, and the maturing of the proletarian crisis precisely in Europe, all rendered necessary the slogan of the Socialist Soviet United States of Europe as a transition to the European Asia and then the World Union of Proletarian States, end quote. Trotsky. Excuse me. Sorry, I fucked that up. That's not from Trotsky. That's from the draft program, the Comintem prepared by Bukharin. Only after discussion in the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU did this formulation disappear from the draft program as the draft program was presented to the ECCI. It was the mutual dependence of the states of Europe, the traditions common to that continent, which led Trotsky to insist on the conception of the revolutionary process, characteristic of the First Congress of the Comintern, as a, quote, worldwide conflagration, end quote, which leapt easily over national frontiers. From this, Trotsky drew the following conclusion, which ran counter to the realities of the time, quote, for the proletariat of every European country, even to a larger measure than for the USSR, the difference, however, is one of degree only. It will be most vitally necessary to spread the revolution to the neighboring countries and to support insurrections in neighboring countries with arms in hand, not out of any abstract considerations of international solidarity, which in themselves cannot set the classes in motion, but because of these vital considerations, which Lenin formulated hundreds of times, namely, that without timely aid from the international revolution, we will be unable to hold out, end quote. Trotsky. The fatalism of such statements in the 11th year of the October Revolution is evident. It was not so much socialism in one country that alarmed Trotsky as the insufficiently thought out character of socialism in one country's theoretical model, which threatened to doom the USSR to self-isolation from the surrounding world and arbitrary conduct by the USSR's ruling elite. But instead of constructive cooperation in the working out of a new model, the logic of intra-party struggle led Trotsky into merely seeking for the weak points in his opponent's conceptions, misusing his polemical skill at the expense of Marxist theoretical analysis. The question of the weakness of the Stalin-Bukharin conception of the building of socialism in one country goes beyond the limits of the present work. Let us turn our attention to the weak spot in its chief critic, namely his thesis on the increasing contradiction between the growth of the productive forces and the national state form of their distribution. The first factor is treated as absolute. Here Trotsky is close to orthodox social democracy, in the spirit of Karl Kautsky, and the possibility of superstructural regulation of economic growth, which, as a rule, was carried out by the national state, was clearly underestimated. What we see, in fact, is a forcing of the terms of the problem to accommodate a ready-made solution, namely, quote, world revolution. Here too, though, Trotsky puts forward some extraordinarily fruitful ideas, one of which is an elaboration of the question of the influence of technical progress, or, as we should say today, the scientific and technological revolution, on the competition between the two systems. Permit me to introduce a lengthy quotation, quote, the new theory has made a point of honor of the freakish idea that the USSR can perish from military intervention, but never from its own economic backwardness. But inasmuch as in a socialist society, the readiness of the toiling masses to defend their country must be much greater than the readiness of the slaves of capitalism to attack that country, the question arises, why should military intervention threaten us with disaster? Because the enemy is infinitely stronger in his technology. Bukharin concedes the preponderance of the productive forces only in their military technical aspect. Bukharin does not want to understand that a Ford tractor is just as dangerous as a Creusot gun. with the sole difference that while the gun can function only from time to time, the tractor brings its pressure to bear upon us constantly, end quote. Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin, page 16. All of Trotsky is in these words: brilliant polemical wit, ability to clothe Marxist categories in the vivid form of graphic formulations, and at the same time exaggeration in his own ideas, unquestioning faith in his initial axioms. Descending from theoretical generalizations to questions of practical politics, Trotsky depicts the unenviable fate of the Comintern in the event that it should adopt the theory of socialism in one country. Quote, the task of the parties in the Comintern assumes, therefore, an auxiliary character. Their mission is to protect the USSR from intervention and not to fight for the conquest of power. It is, of course, not a question of the subjective intentions, but of the objective logic of political thought. End quote. Trotsky. The Third International after Lenin. These would seem to be prophetic words, spoken on the eve of the complete Stalinization of the Comintern, which really did, in a number of instances, transform the Comintern into an instrument of the USSR's foreign policy, but in them there was only a reflection of the truth. The, quote, logic of political thought, end quote, in Trotsky's case, led to Trotsky's counterpoising of two component parts of the Comintern ideology, reducing everything to, quote, the false comparative evaluation of the two levers of world socialism, the lever of our economic achievements and the lever of the worldwide proletarian revolution. Without a victorious proletarian revolution, we will not be able to build socialism, end quote. Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin. However, the Achilles here is not in the counterpoising of the, quote, levers, but in the reduction of the levers, but the reduction to the levers of all the wealth of forms that social progress assumes. The opposition's reaction to the left course adopted by the Communist Party Soviet Union and the Comintern was set out in Trotsky's declaration to the 6th Congress of the Comintern dated 12th of July, 1928. The document is dominated exclusively by the, quote, Russian question. Trotsky sees in this a certain contradiction with his oaths of loyalty to the ideal of world revolution, and offers an explanation which is not very convincing. Quote, a correct domestic policy in the USSR is inconceivable without a correct policy for the Comintern. Therefore, for us, the question of the Comintern's line, that is, the strategic line of the international revolution, stands above all other questions. However, a situation is developed historically in which the key to the Comintern's policy is the policy of the All-Union Communist Party. End quote. Trotsky, the challenge of the left opposition. Following attentively events in the country, Trotsky stresses his view that, quote, whoever thinks that the present shift by the party apparatus has canceled out the right danger is radically wrong, end quote. That danger was never so great as now. Consequently, quote, the opposition supports every step, even a hesitant step, towards the proletarian line. Every attempt, even an indecisive attempt, to resist the Thermidorian elements, the opposition cannot have anything in common with, combinationist adventurism, counting on the aid of the right to overthrow the center, end quote. Trotsky, the challenge of the left opposition. So then, the choice of strategy had been made, with Stalin against Bukharin, maybe, but with Bukharin against Stalin, never. Let's remember these words. Very soon in September, all would change places, but in the hot summer of 1928, quote, tempos decided everything, end quote. and the tempo of the political struggle was determined by Stalin. One can only guess what collisions would have awaited the party leadership had Trotsky been in Moscow in those days. But Trotsky was in exile in Alma-Ata, writing and sending out his declaration to the Congress, and not suspecting that at that very time, the bloc between Stalin and Bukharin was suffering an irreparable split. At the July plenum of the party's Central Committee, they had managed to settle their conflict, which related, in the first place, to the taking of emergency measures for grain procurement. Stalin gave ground. However, the Sixth Congress of the Comintem was approaching, and with it the threat of a fresh conflict. Already at the beginning of June, Bukharin had written to Stalin, quote, "I told you that I am not going to fight and don't want to. I know too well what a fight could mean, especially in the conditions in which our country and our party find themselves today. I now ask you to think over one thing. Let the Congress take place. Don't cause any splits here. Don't create an atmosphere of gossip. This isn't helped by such things as the impatient sending away of Slepkov." End quote. Bukharin. Wikipedia says, Alexander Slepkov lived from 1899 to 1937. Alexander Slepkov was a Soviet journalist, historian, and Communist Party functionary executed for Alexander Slepkov's opposition to the forced collectivization of agriculture. Back to the text. During the July plenum, it became clear to Bukharin that his request had remained a voice crying in the wilderness, and Bukharin decided upon a step which he had denounced 1,000 times in previous years. Bukharin began to seek allies among the oppositionists. On the 11th of July, Bukharin met with Kamenev and put his cards on the table. Quote, "We consider Stalin's line disastrous for the revolution as a whole. This line could bring our downfall. The differences between us and Stalin are many times more serious than all the differences we had with you, ... And for several weeks I have not spoken with Stalin. Stalin is an unprincipled intriguer who subordinates everything to the preservation of his own power. Stalin changes his theories depending on whom he wants to get rid of at the moment." End quote. Bukharin. Footnote. A note of this conversation made by Kamenev is in the Trotsky archives at Harvard University. The writer thanks Stephen Cohen for enabling him to use it in this work. End footnote. Stephen Cohen, who wrote the big biography of Bukharin. Back to the text, or end footnote. Although Bukharin did not openly offer to form a bloc with Trotsky, only Zinoviev and Kamenev were involved. It was a question of a possible combination of all against Stalin. This demanded lightning decisions, of which Kamenev was incapable. Kamenev had not recovered from the wounds he had suffered as one of the leaders of the united opposition, and at the same time his repentance had been regarded by Trotsky as amounting to capitulation. Nevertheless, Kamenev kept up contact with Trotsky, as is proved by the following passage in his note of the conversation on the 11th of July. Quote, "I gave him your personal letter. He read it and said he is afraid of having things on paper. He is afraid a written article would bring trouble. It would be better to talk about the program in person." Bukharin, quote, "Stalin spoiled the program for me in many places. He himself wanted to give the report on the program at the plenum, ! 3 times. I had great difficulty fighting him off. He is driven by a desire for recognition as a theorist. He thinks that is the only thing he hasn't done that he doesn't have, end quote. Bukharin. End quote. Kamenev. Footnote. Kamenev had probably handed to Bukharin Trotsky's critique of the draft program of the Comintem. In the circumstances and illusions of this conversation, there are still too many secrets that historians will have to reveal. Clearly, in the summer of 1928, there was an opportunity to change the balance of forces in the leadership of the CPSU. However, the ditches dug by the representatives of the Bolshevik, quote, old guard, in their intensive conflict of 1926 to 27, proved to be too deep, and their ideological convictions too weak, as compared with the discipline of the Stalinist party apparatus. We do not know how Trotsky would have reacted if Trotsky had known of the conversation which had taken place between Bukharin and Kamenev on the 11th of July. However, in his postscript to his declaration to the 6th Congress of the Comintern, titled The July Plenum and the Right Danger, dated 22nd of July, a simply hysterical view of the situation is given. Rykov has openly triumphed over Stalin. The leftward shift was just an episode, and a turn to the right is about to happen again. Quote, we say to our party and to the Communist International, Rykov is openly beginning to surrender the October Revolution to the enemy classes. Stalin is standing now on one foot, now on the other. Bukharin is clouding the mind of the party with the cobwebs of reactionary scholasticism. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Trotsky was analyzing Rykov's report to the Moscow party activists on the 13th of July, 1928. Back to the text. Trotsky turned out to be a poor chess player. Concentrating his attention on the right flank, Trotsky failed to notice the pawn that was breaking through towards his queen. However, the left opposition itself, having been expelled from the party, was by the summer not at all an ideological monolith. After the, quote, capitulation of Kamenev and Pyatakov, the principal figures on the opposition's chessboard were Trotsky and Radek. Two players who had been well known in the first years after October, two important theoreticians of the Comintern, enjoying great popularity in the communist parties abroad. Their talents as polemicists and publicists ensured for them the role of ideological leaders even after the exiling of the most active oppositionists. Immediately after his arrival at Alma-Ata, Trotsky dispatched telegrams to all the places where he thought Radek might be, asking after his health and requesting regular contact. Radek replied extremely curtly without revealing his own cards. So long as they were united in defining the, quote, rights as the main driving force in the Thermidorian degeneration of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet state, matters did not come to a split between them. However, the differences on questions of strategy and tactics for the Comintern, which had existed between Trotsky and Radek in the period of the united opposition, prepared the way, on the eve of the 6th Congress, for a serious breach between the two men. At the same time as Trotsky sent his declaration to the Congress Presidium, a letter was also sent to the Congress Presidium, signed by Radek and also by I.T. Smilga. Wikipedia says Ivar Smilga lived from 1892 to 1938 and was a Latvian Bolshevik leader, Soviet politician, and economist. Ivar Smilga was a member of the left opposition in the Soviet Union. Back to the text. At the same time as Trotsky sent his declaration to the Congress Presidium, a letter was also sent to it signed by Radek and also by I.T. Smielga, which claimed unambiguously to be an official document of the opposition, it concluded with these words, quote, "We are sure that we are speaking on behalf of all Bolshevik Leninists who have been expelled from the CPSU and are in exile," end quote. Radek's letter contained the fundamental propositions of the opposition's platform presented to the 15th Congress, singling out in the international section those opportunities missed by the Comintern, which were connected with intention to Radek's own theoretical innovations, especially the program he worked out for transitional demands to be advanced by the Communist parties before beginning the immediate struggle for power. The document presented by Radek also rejected the draft program of the Comintern as, quote, reflecting the mechanization of its intellectual life, end quote, and hailed the, quote, left turn projected by the Ninth Plenum of the ECI. The approach seemed to be substantially the same as Trotsky's, but what Trotsky might permit in the case of his political allies, he could not permit to a rival for influence in his, quote, own circle. In general, the entire subsequent fate of Trotsky and the movement Trotsky headed was a succession of splits and capitulations, which deprived first the, quote, Bolshevik Leninist opposition, and then the Fourth International, not so much of mass influence and social base, they lacked those from the start, as of sincere supporters. Contrary to its leaders' proclamations of a world historical mission, the Trotskyist movement degenerated further and further into a sect of left intellectuals, and the main responsibility for that degeneration lay not so much with Trotsky's authoritarian characteristics as with the organizational principles for building the party which Trotsky advocated and which did not depart from the framework of pre-revolutionary Bolshevism. One second. Having received from third persons the letter of Radek and Smielga to the Sixth Congress, Trotsky sent to his supporters on the 17th of July, the day the Congress opened, the same sharp comments upon it. Unlike Radek, who had hailed the leftward shift in the Comintern and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Trotsky's feeling about this was more skeptical. While waging a campaign against the Kulak, the Stalinists had not abandoned their block with the, quote, rights. Quote, matters are even worse when we come to the question of the Comintern. Radek's assessment of the February plenum as a great, in a way decisive turn on to the road of Marxist policy is fundamentally incorrect. The symptomatic significance of the February plenum is very great. It shows that the right centrist policy has landed completely in a blind alley, and that the leadership is trying to find a way out, not to the right but to the left. But that is all. There is no unifying idea in the leftism of the February plenum. This leftism reminds one of a great deal of the leftism of the Fifth Congress, end quote. Trotsky. From a piece titled On Comrade Radek's Theses, which is, I guess, published in the Challenge of the Left Opposition. End footnote. Trotsky charged Radek with conciliatory attitudes, though he refrained from speaking plainly about this. Quote, the general appraisal of the draft program in Radek's theses is incorrect. That is, it is excessively good-natured, contradictory, eclectic, scholastic, full of patches. The draft program is no good at all, end quote. Later, in the arrogantly witty style typical of Trotsky, Trotsky remarked regarding Radek's cautious criticism of the mistakes in the draft, quote, it is as if Marxist man has already emerged full-grown out of the centrist monkey, but with one superfluous organ, quote, the tail. His greatest objections were to Radek's newest estimate of the prospects of the Chinese Revolution. In defiance of all the facts, Trotsky continued to insist on its socialist character, writing about the, quote, Chinese October, and regarding the summer of 1928 as merely a temporary ebbing of the revolutionary wave. The situation in the opposition on the eve of the Sixth Congress bore witness to the fact that the attainment of critical mass on the eve of the 15th Party Congress entailed an irrepressible process of nuclear fission, artificially stimulated by Stalin, whose emissaries regularly visited the oppositionists, promising them return to high positions in party and state if they would repudiate Trotsky. In his letter, Radek declared without ambiguity that he was ready for reconciliation. Quote, "If history proves that a number of party leaders with whom we crossed swords yesterday are better than the theories which they defended, then no one will be more pleased than we." End quote. For Trotsky, of course, there was no such road. Trotsky could agree to anything except repentance before the Stalinist apparatus. The documents addressed by Trotsky to the Comintem Congress, which opened on the 17th of July, 1928, came to be known to the delegates and were even discussed in the corridors, but in the actual Congress serious references to them were made only in order to discredit political opponents in various parties. Yet Trotsky's name and his theory of, quote, permanent revolution were very freely referred to by opponents. It is enough to read the discussion between Walter Ulbricht and A. Evert on the, quote, right danger in the German Communist Party, and the differences between V. Lamanadze and J. Pepper on the significance of the Canton Uprising. I don't know who this A. Evert is. I'm going to look them up. According to Wikipedia, Arthur Evert lived from 1890 to 1959 and was a German communist political activist and functionary of the Communist International Comintern. Evert is best remembered as an official Comintern representative to the United States, China, Argentina, and Brazil during the late 1920s and 1930s, after being subjected to torture and sentenced to 13 years in prison for his political activity in Brazil. Arthur Evert lost his sanity. Arthur Evert was granted amnesty in May 1945 and ultimately returned to East Germany, where he lived out the rest of his life in a series of medical facilities. J. Pepper refers to Joseph Pagani, known in English as John Pepper or Joseph Pagani, who lived from 1886 to 1938. John Pepper was a Hungarian communist politician. John Pepper later served as a functionary in the Communist International, Comintern in Moscow, before being cashiered in 1929. Apparently, cashiered means generally within military forces a ritual dismissal of an individual from some position of responsibility for a breach of discipline. Later, as an official in the Soviet government, John Pepper ran afoul of the secret police and was executed during the Great Terror of 1937 to 38. Back to the text. Yet Trotsky's name and Trotsky's theory of, quote, permanent revolution were freely referred to by opponents. It is enough to read the discussions between Walter Ulbricht and Arthur Evert on the, quote, right danger in the German Communist Party and the differences between V. Lamanadze and J. Pepper on the significance of the Canton Uprising. Quote, Trotskyism, as understood by the participants in the Congress, in their official speeches at any rate, had long lost any definite features and had become transformed into a sort of bogey, which was actively utilized in struggles for personal influence in particular sections of the Comintern. The absence of open supporters of Trotsky from the Congress did not help at all to clear its atmosphere of pre-storm moods. The results of the previous July plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union, which Trotsky had seen as a victory over the rights over the centrists, were perceived by many of the delegates as being, rather, the prelude to a turn in the struggle inside the party, the, quote, corridor Congress, end quote. The latent clashes between Stalinists and Bukharinists in various parties had grown heated even without this far from simple situation, so that, in order to counter the spreading of rumors, the Soviet delegation to the Comintern issued on the 30th of July a statement to the Council of Senior Delegates in which they denied the truth of speculations about differences in the party leadership. The Dutch delegate, De Vieser, alone subjected to criticism at a plenary session the isolated position of the Communist Party Soviet Union and the way information about events in the USSR was kept from the brother parties. Quote, often, where important political questions were concerned, for example, in connection with the fight against the Trotskyist opposition or with Yofa's well-known letter, our party and our papers were left without news. Was the report that Trotsky had been exiled true or not? ... It is absolutely necessary that the International improve its service of information regarding the most important facts, especially where the USSR is concerned, end quote. Louis de Visser lived from 1878 to 1945 and was a Dutch communist politician and activist. Back to the text. Trotsky not only followed closely the reports of the Congress proceedings printed in Pravda, Trotsky also received information from his comrades in arms about the actual sentiments prevailing among the delegates. Trotsky's archives contain letters from Moscow in which are quoted statements by prominent delegates testifying to their discontent and skepticism regarding the official line of the Comintern. One of these letters quotes these words spoken by Ercole, or Palmiro Togliatti, who was like the head of the Communist Party of Italy. Quote, our tragedy has been that it was impossible to speak the truth about the most important, most decisive problems of the day. We didn't dare to speak. In this atmosphere, the voice of truth would have had the effect of a bomb exploding, end quote. The Stalinist sappers did their work faultlessly. The speech of the Indonesian delegate, Alfonso, who in the discussion on the program supported a number of the opposition's proposals, was reduced in the official Congress report to one paragraph. Trotsky's hopes of a rapid breakup of the bloc of the rights and the centrists in the CPSU and the Comintern looked as though they would be confirmed as the Congress proceeded. However, a similar process was going on among the oppositionists themselves, evidence of which was given by the declarations that Preobrazhensky and Radek sent to the Congress. In return, it was mentioned that many of the differences had disappeared since the Comintern, and the CPSU had adopted the, quote, left course, which had long been advocated in the opposition. Footnote, see Deutscher, The Prophet Unarmed. Trotsky had to make great efforts in order to ensure unity among his supporters, but Trotsky was unable to counterpoise anything to the tendency whereby the, quote, leftward shift, end quote, of Stalin's course, and still more Stalin's open conflict with the, quote, rights, was stimulating a, quote, capitulationist mood among the oppositionists. At the 6th Congress of the Comintern, the question of the opposition in the CPSU is considered near the end of proceedings. 22nd of August, Manuilski's report. In the political report of the ECCI, which was given by Bukharin, this matter had been touched on only in passing. Bukharin remained faithful to the political, quote, distortions, according to which the Trotskyism was a social democratic deviation in the communist movement. But Bukharin added that after the defeat of the opposition in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, attempts of the, quote, ultra-lefts to form an international organization of their own had been smashed, and what now came to the forefront was the danger of a, quote, right deviation. This belated manifestation of political realism, this return to an actual evaluation of the different tendencies in the Comintern, did not save Bukharin from being charged, less than a year later, with, quote, right deviation in the Comintern, end quote, a construct which proved no less useful to Stalin than the, quote, social democratic deviation, end quote, ascribed to Trotsky. In Manuilski's report, along with some of the worst examples of intra-party polemic on the position of the Trotskyists after the 15th Congress, quote, the laughable statements made by persons who had lost their sense of the comic about their willingness to help in implementing the, quote, left zigzag, end quote. There were included some interesting ideas about the enthusiasm of Trotsky supporters for the proletarian dictatorship, functions of administrative coercion, and their exclusive orientation on the Western communist parties as instruments of world revolution. These accusations were very soon to change their address and enter into the ideological arsenal of the Bulletin of the Opposition when it criticized the, quote, great change and the flowering of Stalinism, but, all in all, was much altered by this rearrangement of items. Question mark. But all in all was much altered by this rearrangement of items. The Comintern Congress ended its work on the 1st of September. The autumn of 1928 was the time when Stalin actively prepared for the decisive, final battle for exclusive leadership of the party, the arena for which would also include the Comintern. The Rights replied by boycotting political activity. After the Congress, Bukharin did not even attend the meetings of the Presidium of the ECCI. Like Trotsky in his time, Bukharin and his comrades hoped that, without them, the machinery of the state, the party and the Comintern, would grind to a halt, and they were mistaken. In his turn, Trotsky continued to calculate which of the contending groups Trotsky would make an agreement with. That he would certainly be called upon, he had no doubt, even on the eve of his banishment from the USSR. However, in September, Trotsky withdrew the slogan, quote, with Bukharin never, end quote, and put it in the forefront of the problem of the suppression of party democracy and the omnipotence of the bureaucratized apparatus, including that of the Comintern. Trotsky's biographer, Deutscher, describes accurately enough the situation when Trotsky found himself equidistant from both groups in the leadership of the CPSU. Quote, if Stalin was taking one leaf out of Trotsky's book, The Left Course, Bukharin took another. He appealed to the left opposition in the name of proletarian democracy. Trotsky was in a quandary. Trotsky could not turn a deaf ear to Bukharin's appeal without denying one of his own principles, and he could not respond to it without acting, or appearing to act, against another principle of his, by which he was committed to support the left course, end quote. Trotsky. End quote, Deutscher. Isaac Deutscher, that's Isaac Deutscher, excuse me. As a result, Trotsky took up a waiting attitude, although in a number of letters, the first of them dated the 12th of September, Trotsky also spoke of a possible conditional bloc with the rights and defense of the principles of party democracy. This produced a negative reaction among most of the Trotskyists, and Trotsky had to settle another crisis in his own ranks. Nevertheless, Trotsky did manage to perceive, in the autumn of 1928, that the danger threatening from Stalin's despotism was very much greater than that from all the rights put together. Unlike Radek, who continued to affirm that, quote, if we strike a blow at the center, we shall become manure for the rights, end quote, Trotsky tried to clarify the social roots of centrism, and even came to the conclusion that Stalin personified the interests of the middle peasant, exclamation point. But this did not last long. Already in his first letters from abroad, Trotsky sees a different content in Stalinism, as the accomplished bureaucratic degeneration of the proletarian state, and uses for the first time the actual term, quote, Stalinism. Footnote, quote, Stalin's polemics are only the belated echo of his organizational technique. What Stalinism is, above all, is the automatic working of the apparatus, end quote. Trotsky, Writings, 1929. End footnote. But the beginning of a new stage in this theoretical work was made in a letter of the 21st of October, 1928, in which Trotsky came out sharply against a bloc with the center and called the situation in the country, quote, a Kerensky period in reverse, end quote. The moderate Trotskyists, headed by Radek, saw this as a slide down into the position of the democratic centralist faction, which demanded not reform of the party, but a revolution in the party. It was not accidental that the, quote, shift to the left, end quote, in Trotsky's view coincided with a harshening of the regime under which he was held in exile. Later, Trotsky was to recall, quote, during the first 10 months of exile, our letters, though censored, nevertheless reached their destinations roughly 50% of the time. Toward the end of October last year, a sudden change occurred. Our communications with co-thinkers, friends, and even relatives were suddenly stopped short. Letters and telegrams ceased to reach us at all, end quote. Trotsky. In the autumn of 1928, there took place, or rather continued, the process of mutual recognition between Lenin's two, quote, heirs. While Stalin understood that Trotsky's views were parrying more and more his own intentions, and were therefore becoming increasingly dangerous, Trotsky understood the fate that awaited him on that account. In one of his first articles written in Constantinople, Trotsky noted that, quote, as early as the first weeks of the campaign against the right wing, in a letter to my co-thinkers from Alma Ata, on November 10th of last year, I wrote that Stalin's tactical objective was, when the moment was right, quote, when the right wing had been sufficiently terrified to turn his fire abruptly against the left, ... The campaign against the right is only to build up momentum for a new onslaught against the left. Whoever fails to understand this has understood nothing, end quote, Trotsky. And yet an exaggerated estimation of his own movement. In one of his letters to Radek, he wrote, quote, we are the vanguard of the vanguard, end quote, prevented Trotsky from perceiving the true relation of forces in the leadership of the CPSU. In Moscow, what was happening was more serious than a mere campaign to, quote, frighten the Bukharinists. Stalin actually deprived Bukharin supporters of potential allies from the left opposition, not only by means of repressive measures, the mass exiling of Trotsky's supporters, which went on all through 1928, but also by his playing at leftism, with the uprooting in the autumn of 1928 of the, quote, right deviation, end quote, in the Comintem sections, particularly the German party. On the eve of his open clash with Ivanovich's opposition, however, Stalin decided to cover his left flank firmly, and so it brought before the Politburo the question of banishing Trotsky from the USSR. According to Trotsky himself, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky voted against this, but were in a minority. The decision to banish Trotsky already failed to fit in with the resolutions about not allowing, quote, international consolidation of the forces of the Trotskyist opposition, end quote, that had been passed by plenums of the ECCI since 1926. Stalin showed by this move that he looked on the interest of the Comintern as merely derivative of his own political ambitions. Trotsky, however, was during another 4 years to call for the emancipation of the Comintern from Stalin's dictatorship. So strong was his prejudice against a, quote, second party, and consequently a Fourth International. On the 16th of December 1928, after the GPU had presented him with their ultimatums, Trotsky addressed a message to the leadership of the Communist Party Soviet Union and the Comintern, realizing that this letter, too, would remain unanswered. For him, what mattered most was political self-justification. Quote, the demand that I abstain from political activity is equivalent to demanding that I renounce the struggle for the interests of the international proletariat, that I renounce the struggle for the interest, a struggle which I have waged uninterruptedly for 32 years, that is throughout my conscious life, end quote. Listing in his letter the mistakes made by the Comintern, beginning with the defeat of the German October in 1923, Trotsky explains them all by the circumstance that the wrong leaders were at the helm, since the Communist Party Soviet Union was seen as the legitimate leadership of the Comintern. Quote, if this blind, cowardly, incompetent policy of adaptation of the bureaucracy and the petty bourgeoisie had not been followed, the situation of the working masses in the 12th year of the dictatorship will be far more favorable. Our military defense would be far stronger and more reliable. The Comintern would be in quite a different position and would not have to retreat step by step before the treacherous and venal social democracy, end quote. Trotsky. The decision to banish Trotsky from the USSR, which was conveyed to Trotsky on 18th of January 1929, provoked not only a lively echo in the international labor movement, but also much diplomatic activity. Stalin did all Stalin could to prevent Trotsky from finding a place of asylum in Europe. Trotsky himself had chosen Germany. When he learnt of the pressure being brought to bear on the German government in this connection, one of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, F. Stempfer, wrote to Chancellor H. Müller, who was also a social democrat, quote, I have learnt with horror that objections have been put up against the admission of Trotsky. I quite fail to understand this. We have stood, as a matter of principle, for the German Republic to offer the right of political asylum to everyone who is obliged to leave his country owing to lack of freedom there. I do not see any practical grounds for departing from this principle. We cannot, after all, refuse to Trotsky what we grant to countless ultra-reactionary Russians. Trotsky could not do us any harm. Trotsky will not damage Russo-German relations. Since Russia herself has asked if we will accept him, if he can harm anyone, it can only be the communists, end quote. F. Stempfer, writing to Reich Chancellor H. Müller, who was also a social democrat. According to Wikipedia, Friedrich Stempfer lived from 1874 to 1957 and was a German journalist and politician in the SPD. And Wikipedia says Hermann Müller, who lived from 1876 to 1931, was a German social democratic politician who served as foreign minister from 1919 to 1920 and was twice Chancellor of Germany, 1920, 1928 to 1930, during the Weimar Republic. Müller rose quickly through the ranks of the Social Democratic Party after joining it in 1893. Müller was elected to the Reichstag of the German Empire in 1916 and to the Weimar National Assembly in 1919. In Hermann Müller's capacity as foreign minister, Hermann Müller was one of the German signatories of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June, 1919. During the 3 months Müller was chancellor in 1920, Müller's government passed a number of progressive social reforms before it had to resign due to the SPD's poor showing in the 1920 election. In Hermann Müller's second term as chancellor, from June 1928 to 1930, Hermann Müller led a grand coalition through a period marked by budgetary and international relations issues. The coalition broke apart after the onset of the Great Depression, and Müller, already suffering from poor health, died a year after leaving office. Back to the text. The refusal of the German government to grant asylum to Trotsky, in which not the least important factor was fear of strengthening the radical tendencies in the labor movement, evoked official condemnation by the Labor and Socialist International. The leader of the Russian Social Democrats in isolation, Fyodor Dan, called the banishment of Trotsky an example of medieval barbarism. Quote, and although in the times when the, quote, new method, end quote, was first tried out on Russia's Social Democrats, Trotsky stood along with Lenin at the summit of power and therefore bears responsibility for all that. We Russian Social Democrats have no feeling of schadenfreude. I don't know what that word means. Gloating or malicious joy seems to be like what schadenfreude refers to. This is because the moral and psychological attitude of the Social Democrats to the Communists is determined by their political attitudes, which, in contrast to the Bolshevist attitude, is not oriented on deepening and perpetuating the split, but on drawing closer and reuniting the Communist and Social Democratic wings of the labor movement. End quote. Fyodor Dan. Trotsky, who had to withdraw to one of the Prince's Islands belonging to Turkey, drew his own conclusions from what had happened. The refusal of a government headed by a social democrat to grant his political asylum he perceived as yet another sign of the rottenness of bourgeois democracy in the West, and even more as a sign of the reactionary nature of hopes for a democratic transition to socialism. Deprived of the possibility of exercising direct political influence in the labor movement in the European countries, Trotsky at once set about consolidating the forces of the supporters of world revolution and the worldwide dictatorship of the proletariat, to which theoretical propositions he was to remain faithful to the end of his life. That's the end. Thank you so much for listening.